The ranch foreman's shovel hit something solid beneath the collapsed Smokehouse foundation on a scorching July morning in 1891, a discovery that would force an entire region to confront the darkest chapter of its past. What emerged from beneath 40 years of ash and silence was evidence of a night when justice took a horrifying form, when a man who had endured unspeakable cruelty finally struck back against those who had branded him like cattle and stolen his humanity. This is the story of how one slave's act of vengeance in 1852 became the most carefully buried secret in Western frontier history, where the line between victim and monster blurred in the flames of a smokehouse fire, and where an entire community conspired to hide the truth about what really happened on the Blackwood estate the night the screaming stopped and the smoke carried away more than just the smell of burning wood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell hit them first. Ranch foreman Wesley Ford had been supervising the demolition of the old Blackwood smokehouse for 3 days, but nothing had prepared his crew for what they discovered when their sledgehammers finally broke through the foundation's deepest layer on July 14, 1891. The structure had stood abandoned for nearly 4 decades, its stone walls blackened by a fire that local records claimed had been an accident caused by careless servants. But the iron chains bolted to the interior walls told a different story, as did the human remains scattered across the floor in positions that suggested desperate attempts to reach a door that had been sealed from the outside. Wesley had grown up hearing whispers about the Blackwood estate, rumors that were always cut short when adults noticed young ears listening. The property had sat empty since 1852, slowly crumbling into the Colorado prairie while the town of Ashford Springs grew up around it. The main house had been torn down in 1875, but the smokehouse had remained untouched, avoided by locals who claimed the ground was cursed. Wesley had dismissed such talk as superstition until his crowbar pried loose a metal plate that revealed words scratched into the stone beneath. "They burned me here first." The discovery brought Sheriff Victor Malone to the site within an hour, his weathered face growing pale as he examined what Wesley's crew had uncovered. Malone was 63 years old and had been wearing a badge since before the war. He had seen his share of violence, but the evidence scattered across the smokehouse floor suggested something far more calculated than a simple fire. The chains were too deliberately placed. The door had been barred with iron brackets that could only have been installed from the outside, and the scratches on the interior walls formed patterns that told a story of prolonged suffering rather than quick death. What made Malone's hands shake as he documented the scene wasn't just the evidence of murder. It was the realization that he had heard stories about this place his entire life, whispered accounts that older residents refused to discuss in detail. His own father had been a deputy in 1852 and had come home one night with burns on his hands and a haunted look in his eyes that never fully disappeared. When young Victor had asked what happened, his father had simply said that some debts get paid in fire, and that the law doesn't always serve justice, sometimes it just buries mistakes. The Blackwood family had been among the wealthiest landowners in the Colorado Territory during the early 1850s, their fortune built on cattle ranching and the supply networks that fed the mining camps scattered throughout the mountains. Harrison Blackwood had purchased the property in 1847, constructing a ranch house that was considered the finest residence between Denver and the New Mexico border. The estate employed over 40 workers at its peak, including 24 individuals whose legal status existed in the gray area between slavery and indentured servitude that characterized frontier labor practices during that era. Colorado had entered the Union as a free territory, but the enforcement of anti-slavery laws was inconsistent in remote areas where federal authority was more theoretical than practical. Men like Harrison Blackwood exploited these gaps, bringing laborers from southern states under contracts that were effectively bondage by another name. The workers were housed in crude barracks behind the main house, fed minimal rations, and subjected to punishments that included branding, whipping, and extended periods of confinement in the smokehouse that was supposedly used for meat preservation. Sheriff Malone knew all this from reading old territorial records, but what he hadn't known was the extent of the brutality or the fact that the Blackwood family's disappearance in 1852 hadn't been the mysterious abandonment that local history claimed. The official story was that Harrison, his wife Catherine, and their 3 adult offspring had simply left Colorado without explanation, selling their property through intermediaries and relocating to California. But the remains Wesley's crew had discovered suggested a far different ending to the Blackwood legacy. The forensic examination began immediately, though the primitive state of 1891 investigative techniques meant that much of the analysis relied on careful observation rather than scientific testing. Dr. Simon Briggs, who served as both the town physician and county coroner, spent 2 days documenting what had been found in the smokehouse. His official report, filed with the territorial court on July 18th, painted a picture that was both meticulous and deeply disturbing. 5 adult skeletons had been recovered from the smokehouse floor, their position suggesting they had been alive when the fire started and had tried desperately to escape the flames and smoke. The bone evidence showed that several victims had suffered broken fingers from pounding on the sealed door, while others displayed fractures consistent with throwing themselves against stone walls in futile escape attempts. The chains bolted to the walls were sized for human restraint, positioned at heights that would have forced their occupants to remain standing or suffer the weight of iron shackles cutting into their limbs. But what captured Dr. Briggs's attention most were the branding irons discovered among the debris, their metal surfaces still bearing the distinctive HB mark that had been Harrison Blackwood's property symbol. The irons showed evidence of repeated use, their handles worn smooth by hands that had applied heated metal to human flesh with systematic regularity. Scattered among the remains were buttons and fabric fragments from clothing that matched descriptions of garments the Blackwood family had been known to wear, expensive materials imported from Eastern manufacturers that set them apart from the rough work clothes common on the frontier. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Briggs discovered something that had been hidden beneath decades of ash and debris. A leather journal, its pages burned around the edges but still partially legible, had been wedged into a gap between foundation stones. The handwriting was crude, the spelling erratic, but the content was unmistakable. It was a record kept by someone who had been held prisoner in the smokehouse, documenting days of confinement, descriptions of punishments inflicted by the Blackwood family, and increasingly desperate plans for escape or revenge. Sheriff Malone read the journal entries by lamplight in his office, the words painting a picture of systematic cruelty that had been hidden behind the Blackwood family's respectable public image. The author identified himself only as J, but his accounts described being branded with the HB mark, whipped for minor infractions, and confined in the smokehouse for periods lasting weeks at a time. The entries spanned from January 1851 to August 1852, ending abruptly with a final passage that sent chills down Malone's spine. "Tonight they pay for every scar they gave me." Tonight the smokehouse serves a different purpose. The discovery transformed what had initially appeared to be a historical curiosity into evidence of a crime that had been deliberately concealed for nearly 40 years. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about what had really happened on the Blackwood estate, and why the truth had been buried so thoroughly that even official records had been altered to hide it. Malone understood that uncovering the full story would require digging into archives, interviewing elderly residents who might remember the events of 1852, and potentially exposing secrets that powerful people had worked hard to keep hidden. The Colorado Territory of 1852 existed in a state of barely controlled chaos, where federal law was an abstract concept, and practical governance was left to whoever could enforce their will through violence or wealth. Ashford Springs had been established only 5 years earlier as a supply depot for mining operations in the surrounding mountains, growing from a collection of canvas tents into a permanent settlement of nearly 800 residents who lived by rules that adapted to frontier necessity rather than Eastern legal traditions. Harrison Blackwood had arrived in 1847 with capital accumulated through cotton trading in Missouri, purchasing 12,000 acres of prairie and mountain land for prices that seemed absurd to established ranchers who understood the challenges of running livestock operations at high altitude. But Blackwood had vision and resources that allowed him to build infrastructure his competitors couldn't match. Within 3 years, he had constructed a ranch house with real glass windows, a network of irrigation systems that kept his pastures productive through dry seasons, and a reputation for business acumen that made him one of the most influential figures in territorial politics. The Blackwood estate sat 5 miles north of Ashford Springs, positioned where the prairie met the foothills in a landscape of rolling grassland broken by stands of cottonwood and pine. The main house had been constructed from limestone quarried in the nearby mountains, its two-story design incorporating architectural elements that were rare on the frontier. Visitors commented on the imported furniture, the collection of books that filled an entire room, and the formal dining hall where Harrison hosted dinners for territorial officials, military officers, and business associates who traveled from Denver to consult with a man whose opinions carried weight in commercial and political circles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But the estate's prosperity rested on a labor system that existed in the shadows of Colorado's free territory status. Harrison had brought workers from Missouri and Kansas, individuals whose legal status was deliberately ambiguous. They weren't technically slaves, because Colorado law prohibited slavery, but they weren't free laborers either. They worked under contracts that specified terms of service lasting years or decades, agreements that had been signed under duress or inherited from family members who had originally made the arrangements. The contracts included provisions for punishment, restrictions on movement, and compensation structures that ensured workers remained perpetually indebted to their employer. The territorial government was aware of these arrangements, but chose to interpret them as legitimate contract labor rather than slavery. The distinction was mostly semantic, designed to avoid conflicts with federal anti-slavery legislation, while allowing wealthy landowners to maintain workforces that functioned exactly like the slave labor systems operating in southern states. Sheriff's deputies and territorial marshals understood that enforcing strict interpretations of free labor laws would alienate the very people who funded government operations through taxes and political contributions. Harrison Blackwood's workforce in 1852 consisted of 43 individuals, including 27 men, 12 women, and 4 teenagers who had been born on the estate to parents already bound by labor contracts. They lived in 3 wooden barracks buildings located behind the main house, structures that were minimally heated in winter and sweltering in summer. The workers received food rations that provided basic nutrition but little variety, clothing allowances that were sufficient to prevent nakedness but not comfortable, and medical care that addressed injuries only when they threatened to permanently disable valuable laborers. The punishment system was designed to maintain discipline through fear rather than excessive violence that might damage property. Workers who violated rules or failed to meet production quotas were subjected to penalties that escalated from reduced rations to whipping to confinement in the smokehouse. The smokehouse was a stone structure measuring 20 feet square with walls 3 feet thick, originally constructed for meat preservation but increasingly used for human detention. It had no windows, minimal ventilation, and a heavy wooden door that could be barred from the outside. Confinement periods ranged from overnight stays for minor infractions to week-long detentions for serious violations. The branding system had been implemented in 1849 after several workers attempted to escape to settlements where their contract status wouldn't be recognized. Harrison had ordered his blacksmith to create irons bearing his initials, then systematically branded every contract worker on the estate. The mark was applied to the left shoulder, a permanent identification that would make escape attempts futile, because any worker found without proper documentation would be immediately identifiable as Blackwood property and subject to return under territorial fugitive labor laws. Catherine Blackwood managed the household staff and maintained the social connections that were essential to her family's status in territorial society. She hosted gatherings that brought together the wives of military officers, territorial officials, and prosperous ranchers, events that showcased the family's wealth and refinement. Catherine was known for her charm, her skill at managing servants, and her firm belief that the labor system her husband employed was both economically necessary and morally justified. She frequently argued that contract workers were better off under Blackwood's supervision than they would be living as free laborers without guaranteed food, shelter, or employment. The Blackwood offspring consisted of 3 adults in their 20s. Thomas was the eldest at 28, being groomed to eventually take over estate management. Margaret was 25 and had recently returned from 2 years at a finishing school in St. Louis. Robert was 23 and served as the estate's overseer, directly supervising the contract workers and administering punishments when his father deemed them necessary. All 3 had grown up considering the labor system normal and the workers as property that required firm management to remain productive and obedient. The estate's prosperity between 1847 and 1852 had made the Blackwood family wealthy by frontier standards. Harrison's cattle operations supplied beef to mining camps throughout the territory. His breeding programs produced horses that sold at premium prices to military buyers, and his political connections secured government contracts that guaranteed steady income regardless of market fluctuations. The family lived in comfort that was extraordinary for the Colorado frontier, with servants who maintained their household, workers who generated their wealth, and social standing that made them untouchable by the limited law enforcement infrastructure that existed in the territory. But beneath the surface of prosperity and respectability, the Blackwood estate operated according to rules that were fundamentally incompatible with the principles of human dignity and freedom that supposedly defined American society. The workers who built that prosperity existed in conditions that differed from slavery only in legal technicalities, subjected to violence and degradation that was hidden from public view by distance, wealth, and the complicity of authorities who benefited from maintaining the status quo. Sheriff Victor Malone's investigation into the Smokehouse discovery quickly revealed that official records from 1852 were incomplete, contradictory, and in some cases obviously falsified. The Territorial Archives in Denver contained a property transfer document dated September 3, 1852, showing that Harrison Blackwood had sold his estate to a land speculation company for $30,000. The sale had been conducted through a legal intermediary named Thomas Whitmore, with all documents signed and notarized in proper form. But there was no record of where the Blackwood family had gone after the sale. No forwarding addresses, no subsequent property purchases in Colorado or neighboring territories, and no correspondence that might indicate their whereabouts after they supposedly left the region. The investigation took on new urgency when Malone discovered that the land speculation company listed as the buyer had never actually existed. The business name, Rocky Mountain Development Corporation, appeared on no other legal documents from that era. The notary who had supposedly witnessed the signatures, a man named Albert Brennan, had died in 1854 under circumstances that the death certificate described only as accident involving horse. The attorney who had filed the property transfer, Thomas Whitmore, had left Colorado Territory in late 1852 and, according to records maintained by the Territorial Bar Association, had never practiced law anywhere else, despite supposedly being a licensed attorney. Everything about the Blackwood family's disappearance had been carefully staged to create the appearance of a normal property transaction, while actually concealing something that required falsified documents, non-existent companies, and the involvement of individuals who either died conveniently or vanished shortly after playing their roles in the cover-up. Malone understood that this level of deception required resources, planning, and most importantly, the cooperation of people in positions of authority who could manipulate official records without attracting unwanted attention. His next step was to interview elderly residents who had lived in Ashford Springs during 1852 and might remember details that hadn't been included in official accounts. The task proved more difficult than expected because most people who remembered the Blackwood estate were reluctant to discuss it, offering vague responses that suggested they knew more than they were willing to share. Several residents claimed to have no memory of the family at all, despite being old enough to have lived through the relevant period. Others acknowledged remembering the Blackwoods but insisted they had simply left town, like many other settlers who found frontier life too difficult or had opportunities elsewhere. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Cora Lawrence was 81 years old and had lived in Ashford Springs since 1848. Arriving as a young bride, married to a carpenter who had helped build many of the town's early structures, including the Blackwood Ranch House. She lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, supported by savings her husband had left when he died in 1873. When Malone knocked on her door on July 22, 1891, explaining that he was investigating the discovery at the old Blackwood property, Cora studied him carefully before inviting him inside. Her parlor was crowded with furniture and memorabilia from 4 decades of frontier life, photographs of children and grandchildren covering every available surface. Cora served tea from a porcelain set that looked expensive and out of place in the modest surroundings, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. When Malone asked what she remembered about the Blackwood family, Cora was silent for nearly a minute before responding. She asked whether he was prepared to hear the truth, even if it implicated people he knew, people who were still alive and influential in territorial affairs. When Malone confirmed that he was investigating a potential mass murder and needed facts regardless of who they might embarrass, Cora began to speak. She had known about the labor conditions at the Blackwood estate because her husband had worked there during the initial construction period in 1847 and 1848. He had witnessed the branding of workers, had seen men confined in the smokehouse for days at a time, and had been troubled by the violence that Harrison Blackwood used to maintain discipline. But speaking up would have meant losing work opportunities and potentially facing retaliation from a man who had connections to territorial officials and military officers. Like everyone else who knew what was happening at the estate, Cora's husband had kept quiet and tried to avoid thinking about the suffering that occurred behind those limestone walls. In August 1852, rumors had spread through Ashford Springs that something terrible had happened at the Blackwood estate. The details were confused and contradictory, but everyone agreed that the main house had been abandoned suddenly and that the Blackwood family had disappeared. Some claimed they had left in the middle of the night. Others said they had been killed by workers who had rebelled against brutal treatment. The territorial marshal at the time, a man named Samuel Hartford, had visited the estate with several deputies and emerged hours later with orders that no one was to enter the property under any circumstances. Within days, a notice had been posted claiming the Blackwoods had sold their property and relocated to California. The workers who had lived on the estate had vanished as completely as their employers, scattered to other settlements or simply gone without trace. The few people who asked questions were told that the matter had been resolved, that the Blackwoods had left voluntarily, and that spreading rumors about violence or foul play would be considered slander against a respectable family who had contributed significantly to territorial development. Cora told Malone that her husband had been part of a crew hired to clean out the main house after the Blackwood departure. The house had shown signs of violent struggle, with furniture overturned, bloodstains on floors and walls, and evidence that people had been restrained with ropes in several rooms. But the most disturbing discovery had been in the smokehouse, where the cleanup crew had found remains that Marshal Hartford ordered buried immediately without proper investigation or documentation. The crew had been paid substantial bonuses for their work and warned that discussing what they had seen would result in criminal charges for disturbing a crime scene or interfering with official investigations. The implication was clear. The territorial government had known about the murders at the Blackwood estate in 1852 and had actively participated in covering them up. The false property transfer, the disappeared witnesses, the warnings against public discussion, all of it had been orchestrated to hide the truth about what had happened that night. The question Malone needed to answer was why authorities would go to such lengths to conceal murders that appeared to have been committed by workers rebelling against cruel masters. Frontier justice usually treated such cases harshly, with swift trials and public executions designed to discourage similar uprisings. The elaborate cover-up suggested that the truth about the Blackwood murders involved something that powerful people found more threatening than a simple story of vengeful workers killing abusive employers. The answer emerged when Sheriff Malone obtained access to the personal papers of Samuel Hartford, the territorial marshal who had supervised the initial investigation in 1852. Hartford had died in 1867, but his widow had preserved his documents in a trunk stored in her daughter's attic. When Malone explained that he was investigating historical events related to Hartford's service as marshal, the family reluctantly agreed to let him examine the papers, though they warned him that some of the contents might be disturbing. The trunk contained official correspondence, case files from Hartford's years as marshal, personal journals, and a collection of documents that had been sealed in an envelope marked Blackwood Matter, Confidential. The envelope's contents provided a detailed account of what Hartford had discovered when he arrived at the Blackwood estate on August 17, 1852, responding to reports that the property had been abandoned and that smoke had been visible rising from the smokehouse for nearly 2 days. Hartford's report, written in careful handwriting that suggested he understood the document's potential significance, described a scene that explained why territorial authorities had been so determined to hide the truth. The main house showed evidence of a coordinated attack, with doors forced open, windows shattered, and signs of violent struggle in every room. The Blackwood family members had been restrained with chains that Hartford recognized as having come from the estate's own punishment equipment, the same restraints that had been used on workers confined in the smokehouse. But the family hadn't been killed in the house. They had been dragged to the smokehouse, chained to the walls using the same bolts and shackles that had held so many workers over the years, and left there while someone set fire to the building's interior. The fire had been carefully controlled, burning hot enough to cause suffering, but not so intense that it would quickly kill through smoke inhalation. The positioning of the bodies suggested that the Blackwood family had survived for hours as the heat intensified, their chains preventing escape while forcing them to experience the same terror and pain they had inflicted on others. Hartford had found evidence suggesting that the estate's entire workforce had participated in or witnessed the execution. Footprints surrounding the smokehouse indicated that dozens of people had stood outside while the Blackwood family burned, making no attempt to rescue them or extinguish the flames. The smokehouse door had been reinforced with additional barriers, including a heavy timber beam and iron brackets that would have made opening it impossible even if someone had wanted to intervene. Most significantly, Hartford had discovered the branding irons arranged in a deliberate pattern outside the smokehouse entrance, their metal surfaces still warm from use. The report indicated that someone had branded the Blackwood family members before sealing them in the smokehouse, marking them with the same HB symbol that Harrison had used to mark his workers as property. The act transformed the execution from simple murder into a carefully constructed reversal of the power dynamics that had defined the estate, with victims becoming executioners and masters experiencing the degradation they had inflicted on those they considered property. Hartford's report revealed why the territorial government had chosen cover-up over prosecution. The Blackwood execution hadn't been a spontaneous act of violence by desperate workers. It had been a planned action that demonstrated organizational capability and moral reasoning that contradicted fundamental assumptions about the inferiority of people held in bondage. If word spread that contract workers had successfully overthrown their masters, tried them according to their own sense of justice, and executed them using methods that symbolically reversed the relationship between owner and owned, it would inspire similar actions at other estates throughout the territory. The political implications were staggering. Colorado's economy depended on labor systems that existed in legal gray areas, exploiting workers who had minimal legal protections and few realistic options for escape or redress. If those workers began to see themselves as capable of collective action against masters who abused them, the entire territorial social structure would be threatened. The Blackwood murders had to be hidden, not because authorities sympathized with the victims, but because acknowledging what had really happened would legitimize resistance and potentially spark uprisings that could destroy the labor system supporting territorial prosperity. Hartford's papers included correspondence with Territorial Governor William Preston, who had personally ordered the cover-up and supervised its implementation. The governor's letters made clear that he understood the moral complexity of the situation, acknowledging that Harrison Blackwood had been brutal and probably deserved punishment, but arguing that allowing workers to execute their masters would establish a precedent that would make governance impossible. The solution was to erase the incident from official history, compensate people who helped maintain the fiction that the Blackwoods had voluntarily left Colorado, and ensure that anyone who knew the truth understood the consequences of public disclosure. The most disturbing document in Hartford's collection was a list of names identifying the 43 workers who had been present at the Blackwood estate in August 1852. Next to each name was a notation indicating where that individual had been sent after the execution. Some had been transferred to other estates where they would continue working under contract arrangements. Others had been sold to buyers in territories where their knowledge of the Blackwood incident wouldn't matter. A few had been marked as, quote, disposed of. A phrase that Hartford's journal indicated meant they had been killed to eliminate witnesses who were considered too dangerous to allow continued existence. Sheriff Malone sat in the Hartford family parlor reading these documents, his hands trembling as he realized the full scope of what had been hidden for nearly 40 years. The Blackwood execution hadn't just been covered up through falsified paperwork and convenient disappearances. It had triggered a systematic purge of everyone who had participated in or witnessed the event, scattering survivors across the frontier and eliminating those who couldn't be trusted to maintain silence. The territorial government had treated the incident as a crisis requiring comprehensive response, deploying resources normally reserved for military operations to ensure that the truth never threatened the social order they were working to establish. But one name on Hartford's list caught Malone's attention because of the notation beside it. Josiah Freeman, marked as primary instigator, location unknown, consider extremely dangerous. Unlike the other workers, Freeman hadn't been captured after the execution. According to Hartford's notes, Freeman had disappeared the same night the Blackwood family died, taking with him detailed knowledge of the estate's operations and potentially carrying documents that could prove what had really happened. Hartford had assigned deputies to search for Freeman throughout 1852 and 1853, but no trace of him had ever been found. The journal discovered in the Smokehouse, the document signed only as J, suddenly took on new significance. Sheriff Malone realized he was reading the words of the man who had planned and executed the Blackwood family's deaths, the individual whose actions had been so threatening to territorial authorities that they had spent years trying to locate and eliminate him. And somewhere in Colorado, possibly still alive nearly 40 years after the events, Josiah Freeman might hold the complete truth about what had happened to the Blackwood estate and why it had required such elaborate efforts to conceal. The search for additional documentation led Sheriff Malone to the Colorado Territorial Archives in Denver, where records from the 1850s were stored in a basement facility that smelled of mold, old paper, and the accumulated dust of decades. The archivist, a meticulous man named Reed Palmer, who had spent 20 years organizing historical documents, initially insisted that all materials related to the Blackwood estate had been properly cataloged and contained nothing beyond the property transfer records Malone had already reviewed. But when the sheriff explained the nature of his investigation and showed Palmer copies of Marshall Hartford's confidential papers, the archivist's demeanor changed dramatically. Palmer admitted that during his years organizing the archives, he had discovered several collections of documents that had been deliberately misfiled or hidden within unrelated record groups, seemingly placed there by people who wanted to preserve evidence while making it difficult to locate. One such collection, labeled only as Territorial Labor Disputes 1850 to 1855, contained materials that Palmer had found disturbing enough that he had considered bringing them to official attention, but had ultimately decided against it, fearing the political complications that might result from exposing historical crimes involving prominent families. The collection filled 3 wooden crates and included correspondence between territorial officials, reports from marshals and deputies investigating labor-related incidents, financial records documenting payments made to various individuals for unspecified services, and a series of journals that appeared to have been kept by someone monitoring contract labor operations throughout the territory. The handwriting varied across different documents, suggesting multiple authors, but the content was consistent in describing a systematic program of exploitation, punishment, and occasionally elimination of workers who were considered problematic or dangerous. What made the collection particularly valuable was its inclusion of records that directly contradicted the official narrative about the Blackwood estate. Among the documents was a detailed inventory of property found at the estate in August 1852, listing not just furniture and equipment, but also personal effects belonging to workers who had supposedly been transferred to other locations. The inventory included clothing, tools, personal letters, and items of sentimental value that people wouldn't have abandoned if they were genuinely moving to new employment situations. The implication was clear: the workers hadn't been relocated as official records claimed. They had been eliminated or sold under conditions that prevented them from taking their possessions. More significantly, Palmer's hidden collection contained what appeared to be the original, unedited version of Marshall Hartford's report about the Blackwood investigation. This document was far more detailed than the confidential papers Malone had found in Hartford's personal effects, including information that the marshal had apparently been ordered to remove before filing his official account. The expanded report described finding evidence that the Blackwood execution had been planned for months, with workers secretly organizing, gathering supplies, and coordinating their actions in ways that demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking. According to Hartford's complete report, the workers had spent weeks studying the family's routines, identifying vulnerabilities in the estate's security, and preparing for a coordinated action that would neutralize all 5 family members simultaneously before they could summon help or organize resistance. The attack had occurred during a dinner gathering when all the Blackwoods were in the main house, allowing the workers to secure the building's exits and take control before anyone could escape or send for assistance from neighboring properties. The execution itself had been conducted with ritualistic precision that Hartford found deeply unsettling. The workers had held what they called a trial, presenting evidence of specific crimes committed by each family member, and allowing the Blackwoods to speak in their own defense before pronouncing sentence. The proceeding had lasted several hours, suggesting that the workers weren't acting out of spontaneous rage, but rather implementing a deliberate form of justice that followed procedures they considered legitimate, even if territorial law didn't recognize their authority to judge their masters. Hartford's expanded report included testimony he had gathered from neighbors who lived close enough to the Blackwood estate to have noticed unusual activity during the relevant time period. Several witnesses reported seeing smoke rising from the smokehouse for an extended period, hearing sounds that might have been screaming carried on the wind, and observing workers standing in organized groups around the property in formations that suggested military-style discipline rather than chaotic mob violence. One neighbor, a rancher named Benjamin Thornton, had actually ridden to the estate to investigate the smoke and had been turned away by workers who told him that they were conducting estate business and that his presence wasn't welcome. The most revealing documents in Palmer's collection were personal letters written by Governor William Preston to various territorial officials in the months following the Blackwood incident. These letters made explicit what Hartford's reports had only implied. The territorial government's primary concern wasn't justice for the murdered Blackwood family, but rather preventing the incident from inspiring similar actions at other estates. Preston's correspondence described the Blackwood execution as an act of organized insurrection that threatened the entire territorial economic system and required comprehensive response to ensure it didn't establish a precedent for worker resistance. One letter, dated September 14, 1852, and addressed to the territorial secretary, outlined the specific steps being taken to contain the political damage from the Blackwood incident. Preston had ordered the creation of false documentation showing that the family had voluntarily left Colorado, the systematic relocation or elimination of all witnesses who might contradict that narrative, and the implementation of new security measures at other estates to prevent similar organized actions by contract workers. The letter included budget allocations for these activities, showing that the territorial government had spent over $15,000 on the cover-up, an enormous sum equivalent to nearly $500,000 in 1891 currency. But the most explosive material in Palmer's collection was a series of journals kept by someone who identified himself as an observer working for the territorial governor's office. These journals, spanning from 1850 to 1856, documented systematic monitoring of contract labor operations throughout Colorado Territory, recording incidents of worker resistance, tracking individuals considered potential instigators, and recommending actions to prevent the kind of organized uprising that had occurred at the Blackwood estate. The journals revealed that the territorial government had been operating an intelligence network specifically designed to infiltrate worker populations, identify leaders, and eliminate threats before they could develop into coordinated resistance movements. The observers' journals included detailed profiles of specific individuals, describing their backgrounds, their influence among other workers, their attitudes toward their employers, and assessments of their potential danger to the existing labor system. One profile stood out because of its length and the obvious concern it expressed about the subject's capabilities. The entry was dated March 1851 and described a man named Josiah Freeman, who had arrived at the Blackwood estate in late 1850 after being transferred from a Missouri plantation following an incident the journal described only as, quote, attempted education of fellow laborers regarding legal rights. According to the observer's assessment, Freeman was unusually educated for someone in his position, able to read and write with proficiency that suggested formal schooling despite laws prohibiting slave education. He had reportedly been teaching other workers to read, using whatever materials he could obtain, sharing information about legal procedures and territorial laws, and encouraging discussion of concepts like natural rights and human dignity that the observer considered dangerous propaganda. The profile concluded with a recommendation that Freeman be closely monitored and potentially removed from the Blackwood estate before he could influence other workers toward organized resistance. The journals made clear that territorial authorities had been aware of Freeman's activities for over a year before the Blackwood execution, and had discussed taking action against him but had ultimately decided against it because removing him might have alerted other potential instigators to the government's surveillance capabilities. Instead, they had chosen to let Freeman continue his activities while gathering intelligence about his network of contacts and his methods of organizing other workers. This decision had proven catastrophic when Freeman had used his organizational skills to coordinate the attack that eliminated the Blackwood family and demonstrated to workers throughout the territory that masters weren't invulnerable. Sheriff Malone spent 3 days in the Denver archives reading through Palmer's hidden collection, taking notes on materials that documented not just the Blackwood incident, but a broader pattern of labor exploitation and government complicity that extended throughout Colorado Territory during the 1850s. The documents revealed that the Blackwood estate hadn't been unusual in its brutality. Dozens of other properties had operated under similar conditions, using violence, confinement, and branding to control workers who had minimal legal protections and no realistic options for escape or redress. Dozens. What made the Blackwood incident significant wasn't the cruelty that had preceded it, but rather the fact that workers had successfully organized, judged their masters according to their own moral standards, and executed them in ways that symbolically reversed the power relationships that had defined their existence. The territorial government's elaborate cover-up hadn't been designed to protect the Blackwood family's reputation. It had been implemented to prevent other workers from learning that organized resistance was possible, and that masters could be held accountable for their crimes, even when the legal system refused to act. The final document Malone examined in Palmer's collection was a map showing the locations of contract labor operations throughout Colorado Territory in 1852, with notations indicating which properties had experienced what the Territorial Observer called stability problems in the months following the Blackwood incident. Nearly 30 estates were marked as having dealt with work slowdowns, escape attempts, or minor acts of sabotage that suggested workers were testing boundaries and exploring possibilities for resistance. The territorial government had responded by increasing security measures, restricting worker movements even further, and in several cases, conducting preemptive removals of individuals suspected of having contact with Freeman or knowledge of his organizational methods. But the map also included something that made Malone's investigation suddenly more urgent. Several properties were marked with symbols, indicating that workers from the Blackwood estate had been transferred there after the execution, relocated to remote locations where they could be isolated from other worker populations, and prevented from sharing information about what had happened. 3 of those locations were still operating as ranches in 1891, still employing workers under contract arrangements that differed only slightly from the systems used 40 years earlier. And according to territorial business records, one of those properties was owned by descendants of families who had been directly involved in the original cover-up, people who had inherited not just land and wealth, but also responsibility for maintaining the secrets that protected their family legacies. The implications of what Sheriff Malone had discovered extended far beyond a single incident of frontier justice. The documents he had uncovered revealed that the Blackwood execution had been part of a broader pattern of worker resistance that territorial authorities had systematically suppressed through violence, legal manipulation, and the kind of comprehensive intelligence operations normally associated with military campaigns against enemy forces. The cover-up hadn't been an isolated response to one uncomfortable incident. It had been one component of a coordinated program designed to maintain labor systems that generated enormous wealth for property owners, while denying basic human rights to the workers who created that prosperity. Malone's investigation expanded to include examination of territorial marshal records from other districts, looking for patterns similar to what he had found in Hartford's papers. The search revealed that between 1850 and 1860, at least 15 separate incidents had occurred throughout Colorado Territory involving worker resistance, property destruction, or violence against employers. Each incident had been followed by similar patterns of cover-up, witness elimination, and official documentation that contradicted what had actually happened. The territorial government had developed standardized procedures for handling such cases, treating each one as a security threat rather than a criminal matter requiring proper investigation and public trial. The most disturbing pattern Malone identified involved the systematic tracking and elimination of individuals considered leaders or instigators of worker resistance. Territorial records included lists of names, descriptions of individuals' capabilities and influence, and notations indicating what actions had been taken to neutralize perceived threats. Some people had been transferred to remote locations where they would be isolated from potential followers. Others had been sold to buyers in territories where they would have no knowledge of local conditions or contacts who might support resistance efforts. A significant number had simply disappeared from all records, with notations suggesting they had been killed to prevent them from spreading dangerous ideas or organizational techniques. The implication was clear. The territorial government had known about the murders at the Blackwood estate in 1852 and had actively participated in covering them up. The false property transfer, the disappeared witnesses, the warnings against public discussion, all of it had been orchestrated to hide the truth about what had happened that night. The question Malone needed to answer was why authorities would go to such lengths to conceal murders that appeared to have been committed by workers rebelling against cruel masters. Frontier justice usually treated such cases harshly, with swift trials and public executions designed to discourage similar uprisings. The elaborate cover-up suggested that the truth about the Blackwood murders involved something that powerful people found more threatening than a simple story of vengeful workers killing abusive employers. The answer emerged when Sheriff Malone obtained access to the personal papers of Samuel Hartford, the territorial marshal who had supervised the initial investigation in 1852. Hartford had died in 1867, but his widow had preserved his documents in a trunk stored in her daughter's attic. When Malone explained that he was investigating historical events related to Hartford's service as marshal, the family reluctantly agreed to let him examine the papers, though they warned him that some of the contents might be disturbing. The trunk contained official correspondence, case files from Hartford's years as marshal, personal journals, and a collection of documents that had been sealed in an envelope marked Blackwood Matter, Confidential. The envelope's contents provided a detailed account of what Hartford had discovered when he arrived at the Blackwood estate on August 17, 1852, responding to reports that the property had been abandoned and that smoke had been visible rising from the smokehouse for nearly 2 days. Hartford's report, written in careful handwriting that suggested he understood the document's potential significance, described a scene that explained why territorial authorities had been so determined to hide the truth. The main house showed evidence of a coordinated attack, with doors forced open, windows shattered, and signs of violent struggle in every room. The Blackwood family members had been restrained with chains that Hartford recognized as having come from the estate's own punishment equipment, the same restraints that had been used on workers confined in the smokehouse. But the family hadn't been killed in the house. They had been dragged to the smokehouse, chained to the walls using the same bolts and shackles that had held so many workers over the years, and left there while someone set fire to the building's interior. The fire had been carefully controlled, burning hot enough to cause suffering, but not so intense that it would quickly kill through smoke inhalation. The positioning of the bodies suggested that the Blackwood family had survived for hours as the heat intensified, their chains preventing escape while forcing them to experience the same terror and pain they had inflicted on others. Hartford had found evidence suggesting that the estate's entire workforce had participated in or witnessed the execution. Footprints surrounding the smokehouse indicated that dozens of people had stood outside while the Blackwood family burned, making no attempt to rescue them or extinguish the flames. The smokehouse door had been reinforced with additional barriers, including a heavy timber beam and iron brackets that would have made opening it impossible even if someone had wanted to intervene. Most significantly, Hartford had discovered the branding irons arranged in a deliberate pattern outside the smokehouse entrance, their metal surfaces still warm from use. The report indicated that someone had branded the Blackwood family members before sealing them in the smokehouse, marking them with the same HB symbol that Harrison had used to mark his workers as property. The act transformed the execution from simple murder into a carefully constructed reversal of the power dynamics that had defined the estate, with victims becoming executioners and masters experiencing the degradation they had inflicted on those they considered property. Hartford's report revealed why the territorial government had chosen cover-up over prosecution. The Blackwood execution hadn't been a spontaneous act of violence by desperate workers. It had been a planned action that demonstrated organizational capability and moral reasoning that contradicted fundamental assumptions about the inferiority of people held in bondage. If word spread that contract workers had successfully overthrown their masters, tried them according to their own sense of justice, and executed them using methods that symbolically reversed the relationship between owner and owned, it would inspire similar actions at other estates throughout the territory. The intelligence network that Governor Preston had created to monitor worker populations had been far more extensive than anything Malone had initially imagined. The system included paid informants within worker communities, territorial officials who gathered information during routine property inspections, and even merchants who reported suspicious purchases or conversations that suggested workers were planning collective action. The information flowed to a central office in Denver, where analysts compiled profiles, tracked movement patterns, and recommended interventions before resistance could develop into coordinated uprisings. Financial records showed that the territorial government had invested substantial resources in this surveillance system, spending thousands of dollars annually on informant payments, travel expenses for officials conducting monitoring operations, and compensation for individuals who assisted in the elimination or relocation of problematic workers. The money had come from a budget category labeled as public safety operations, disguising its true purpose while providing legal authorization for expenditures that supported what was essentially a private security service protecting the interests of wealthy property owners. But Malone's investigation also revealed that the surveillance system hadn't been entirely effective at preventing worker resistance. Despite elaborate monitoring and frequent interventions, incidents continued occurring throughout the 1850s, suggesting that workers were developing their own communication networks and organizational methods that could operate beneath the government's surveillance capabilities. Several territorial reports expressed frustration that removing identified leaders didn't stop resistance activities, implying that worker communities were creating distributed leadership structures that made them less vulnerable to decapitation strategies. The breakthrough in understanding the scope of worker organization came when Malone discovered a cache of letters that had been intercepted by territorial authorities in 1853 and preserved as evidence of what they called seditious communication. The letters, written in various hands and using coded language that officials had struggled to interpret, described a network of contacts spanning multiple territories and states. The correspondence suggested that workers were sharing information about labor conditions, warning each other about particularly brutal employers, and coordinating actions designed to protect individuals who were in danger of being eliminated by authorities. One series of letters made specific reference to Josiah Freeman, describing him as someone who had provided crucial knowledge about organizing techniques and legal concepts that workers could use to resist exploitation. The letters indicated that Freeman had continued moving through various territories after the Blackwood execution, staying in different locations only long enough to share information before disappearing again to avoid capture. The writers treated Freeman as a legendary figure, someone whose actions at the Blackwood estate had demonstrated that organized resistance was possible and that masters weren't invulnerable to accountability. Territorial authorities had devoted considerable resources to tracking Freeman's movements, assigning deputies to investigate reported sightings and offering substantial rewards for information leading to his capture. But Freeman had apparently developed sophisticated evasion techniques, using false identities, traveling through remote areas where official presence was minimal, and maintaining contacts who could provide warning when authorities were closing in on his location. The pursuit had continued through most of the 1850s, before territorial officials finally concluded that Freeman had either died or had successfully escaped to locations beyond their jurisdiction. Sheriff Malone's investigation revealed that Freeman's legacy had extended far beyond his personal actions. The organizational methods he had taught workers at the Blackwood estate and shared during his subsequent travels had been adapted and refined by others, creating a body of practical knowledge about how to resist exploitation while minimizing risks of detection and retaliation. Workers throughout the territory had learned to organize secretly, to communicate using methods that authorities couldn't easily intercept, and to support each other in ways that made them less vulnerable to the isolation tactics that property owners used to maintain control. The territorial government's response had been to increase security measures while simultaneously working to legitimize the labor systems that workers were resisting. New territorial laws passed in the mid-1850s had formalized contract labor arrangements, providing legal frameworks that made worker obligations enforceable while offering minimal protections against employer abuses. The legislation had been designed to make resistance illegal while maintaining the appearance of regulating labor conditions in ways that addressed worker grievances. In practice, the laws had strengthened employer control while creating additional criminal penalties that could be used against workers who challenged their conditions. But the most significant finding from Malone's expanded investigation was evidence that the patterns of exploitation, resistance, and cover-up that had characterized the 1850s hadn't ended when Colorado achieved statehood in 1876. The same families who had profited from contract labor systems before the war had adapted their operations to post-war conditions, using different legal structures but maintaining fundamentally similar control over workers who had limited options and minimal legal protections. The ranch properties that had once openly used contract labor now employed workers under wage arrangements that included housing, food, and other benefits structured in ways that kept employees perpetually indebted and unable to leave. Malone discovered that several estates currently operating in 1891 were owned by descendants of families who had been involved in the original cover-up of the Blackwood execution. These properties continued using labor practices that differed only slightly from the systems employed 40 years earlier, maintaining control through debt arrangements, restricted movement, and occasional violence against workers who challenged their conditions. The continuity suggested that the resistance Freeman had inspired hadn't succeeded in fundamentally changing the labor systems operating in Colorado, but rather had forced those systems to adapt and disguise themselves while preserving their essential characteristics. The investigation also revealed that some of the workers who had been transferred from the Blackwood estate after the execution had survived into the 1890s and were still living on properties owned by families connected to the original cover-up. These individuals, now elderly and still working under arrangements that kept them bound to their employers, represented living witnesses to events that had been officially erased from history. Malone realized that interviewing these survivors might provide the detailed testimony needed to document exactly what had happened at the Blackwood estate, and to understand the full scope of the resistance movement that Freeman had helped organize. The deeper Sheriff Malone investigated, the more he understood that the cover-up of the Blackwood execution hadn't been the work of a few corrupt officials acting independently. It had required systematic cooperation from dozens of individuals occupying positions throughout territorial government, law enforcement, the legal profession, and the business community. The network of enablers had included people who directly participated in hiding evidence and eliminating witnesses, as well as others who had simply chosen to ignore obvious inconsistencies in official accounts because questioning them would have threatened their own interests or safety. At the center of the network was Governor William Preston, whose correspondence revealed a man who understood the moral implications of what he was doing but justified his actions through utilitarian reasoning that prioritized social stability over individual justice. Preston's letters showed that he had personally supervised many aspects of the cover-up, from creating false documentation to authorizing payments for individuals who assisted in witness elimination. But Preston had also worked to establish legal frameworks that would prevent future incidents like the Blackwood execution by strengthening employer control over workers and increasing penalties for resistance activities. Preston's relationship with wealthy property owners throughout the territory had been based on mutual benefit rather than simple corruption. The governor had needed political and financial support from men like Harrison Blackwood to maintain his authority and implement his vision for territorial development. In exchange, he had provided protection for labor practices that were legally questionable but economically profitable. The arrangement had created a governing system where law enforcement served the interests of property owners rather than protecting the rights of all territorial residents equally. Marshal Samuel Hartford had been Preston's primary instrument for implementing the cover-up, but Hartford's papers revealed a man increasingly troubled by what he was being ordered to do. The marshal's private journals included passages expressing doubt about the justice of eliminating workers who had acted against genuinely brutal masters, questioning whether the territorial government was serving legitimate public interests, or simply protecting wealthy families from accountability for their crimes. But Hartford had ultimately concluded that maintaining social order required accepting morally compromising positions, and he had continued following Preston's directives even when they conflicted with his personal sense of right and wrong. The legal profession had played a crucial role in creating the paperwork that disguised the truth about the Blackwood incident. Attorney Thomas Whitmore, who had supposedly handled the property transfer, had actually been a territorial agent working directly for Governor Preston. Whitmore's real function had been to create legitimate-looking documentation that would withstand casual scrutiny, while concealing the fact that the Blackwood family hadn't voluntarily sold their property because they were already dead when the transfer documents were created. Whitmore had received substantial compensation for this service before leaving Colorado and establishing a new identity in California, where he lived comfortably on money earned through participation in the cover-up. The network had also included judges who dismissed legal challenges that might have exposed inconsistencies in official records, clerks who misfiled or destroyed documents that contradicted the approved narrative, and notaries who authenticated paperwork they knew to be fraudulent. These individuals had been compensated through various means, including direct cash payments, favorable rulings in their own legal matters, political appointments, and business opportunities that were made available because of their cooperation with the cover-up. Sheriff Malone's investigation revealed that the territorial government had spent over $30,000 between 1852 and 1856 on activities related to covering up the Blackwood incident and suppressing information about similar cases. The money had been disguised through various budget categories and had flowed through multiple intermediaries to obscure its ultimate purposes. The financial trail showed payments to marshals for special investigations, compensation to attorneys for legal consultations, and stipends to territorial officials for administrative services that actually involved participating in witness elimination or evidence destruction. The business community had enabled the cover-up by maintaining silence about labor conditions they knew were brutal and potentially illegal. Merchants who supplied estates with equipment, food, and other necessities had been aware that their customers were operating what amounted to private prisons where workers were confined against their will and subjected to violence for disciplinary purposes. But speaking up would have meant losing profitable business relationships and potentially facing retaliation from wealthy families who could destroy commercial enterprises through economic pressure or legal harassment. Financial institutions had participated by processing transactions they must have known were connected to fraudulent property transfers and witness elimination operations. Banks had accepted deposits from individuals who were being paid to leave the territory after assisting with cover-up activities, had provided letters of credit that allowed people to establish new identities in distant locations, and had facilitated money transfers that disguised the source and purpose of funds flowing to participants in the network. The banking records showed that several prominent financial institutions in Denver had processed dozens of suspicious transactions during the period when the territorial government was actively working to hide the truth about the Blackwood execution. The most disturbing aspect of the enabler network was its self-perpetuating nature. People who had participated in the cover-up became invested in maintaining it because exposure would reveal their own complicity. As years passed, and individuals retired from official positions or moved into private life, they were replaced by successors who were gradually initiated into the truth and given similar choices about whether to maintain the silence or risk their careers and reputations by exposing historical crimes. The system had created multiple generations of officials who knew the truth but chose to preserve the fiction because the alternatives seemed worse. Sheriff Malone discovered that this pattern of generational complicity extended into the 1890s. Several current territorial officials were sons or nephews of men who had participated in the original cover-up, and they had inherited not just knowledge of what had happened but also responsibility for ensuring that the truth remained hidden. These individuals occupied positions in law enforcement, the court system, and territorial administration, where they could monitor investigations and intervene if anyone got too close to exposing the Blackwood incident or similar cases. The investigation also revealed that some enablers had been motivated by genuine belief that they were serving legitimate public interests rather than simply protecting wealthy criminals. Documents written by territorial officials during the 1850s expressed concern that exposing the truth about the Blackwood execution would inspire worker uprisings throughout the territory, potentially leading to widespread violence and economic collapse. These officials had convinced themselves that maintaining social stability justified the morally questionable means they were using, and that the workers eliminated during the cover-up were acceptable casualties in a larger struggle to build civilized society on the frontier. But other enablers had been motivated purely by self-interest, seeing opportunities for profit or advancement by assisting wealthy families who needed help covering up their crimes. These individuals had sold their services to the highest bidder, providing expertise in creating false documents, eliminating witnesses, and manipulating legal processes without apparent concern for the justice of what they were doing. Their correspondence showed calculated assessment of risks and benefits, negotiations over payment terms, and casual discussions of activities that included murder and evidence destruction as routine business matters. The network's effectiveness had depended on its distributed nature, with different individuals handling specific tasks while remaining largely ignorant of the overall operation. Attorneys created false documents without knowing who would be eliminated to prevent them from contradicting those documents. Marshals relocated workers without understanding that they were isolating witnesses who might have testified about the Blackwood execution. Clerks destroyed records without realizing they were concealing evidence of systematic human rights violations. This compartmentalization had made the network more secure, while also allowing participants to maintain plausible deniability about the full scope of what they were enabling. Sheriff Malone understood that exposing the network would implicate some of the most prominent families and institutions in Colorado, potentially destabilizing the political and economic systems that had been built on foundations of hidden crimes and systematic exploitation. The choice he faced was whether to pursue justice regardless of consequences, or to follow the path that so many before him had chosen, by documenting the truth privately, while maintaining public silence that preserved social stability at the cost of accountability for those who had committed or enabled terrible crimes. The breakthrough that connected the 1852 Blackwood execution to ongoing crimes in 1891 came from an unexpected source. Hannah Clark was a 23-year-old schoolteacher who had recently accepted a position in the small settlement of Copper Ridge, located approximately 60 miles northwest of Ashford Springs, in the mountains where several large ranching operations continued employing workers under conditions that differed only marginally from the contract labor systems of the 1850s. Clark had arrived in September 1891 with enthusiasm about bringing education to frontier communities, but within weeks she had begun noticing disturbing patterns in the lives of workers, families who lived on the surrounding estates. Several students in her classroom bore scars that looked suspiciously like brand marks, circular burns on their shoulders or backs that the families claimed had resulted from accidents with cooking fires or ranch equipment. But the consistency of the marks, appearance, and location suggested something more systematic than random accidents. When Clark gently questioned students about their injuries, they became evasive, offering contradictory explanations that seemed rehearsed rather than genuine. The children's reluctance to discuss their scars, combined with the obvious fear their parents showed when Clark tried to raise the subject, convinced her that something deeply wrong was occurring on the estates that employed most of Copper Ridge's adult population. Clark's concerns intensified when one of her students, a 9-year-old girl named Sarah, arrived at school with fresh burns on her forearm and bruises that indicated she had been violently restrained. When Clark examined the injuries and asked what had happened, Sarah initially claimed she had fallen near a branding fire during cattle marking operations. But under gentle questioning, the girl broke down and described witnessing her father being punished for attempting to leave the estate where their family worked. The punishment had involved being chained in a storage building overnight, and when Sarah had tried to bring him water, she had been grabbed by the estate's foreman and deliberately burned as a lesson about interfering with disciplinary procedures. The estate in question was owned by the Whitmore family, descendants of the attorney Thomas Whitmore, who had created the false documentation concealing the Blackwood execution nearly 40 years earlier. The current head of the family, Jonathan Whitmore, operated a cattle ranch that employed over 30 workers under arrangements that technically classified them as wage laborers, but functioned through debt and intimidation to prevent anyone from leaving. Workers were provided housing, food, and supplies through a company store that charged inflated prices, ensuring they remained perpetually indebted to their employer. Attempts to leave before debts were paid were treated as theft of company property and punished accordingly. Hannah Clark had read newspaper accounts of Sheriff Malone's investigation into the Blackwood Smokehouse discovery, and she recognized similarities between what she was observing at the Whitmore estate and the historical patterns Malone had described in his public statements about the 1852 incident. She wrote to the sheriff in late October 1891, describing the conditions she had witnessed and expressing concern that the labor exploitation systems supposedly ended by the war in Colorado statehood were continuing in modified forms that made them harder to identify but no less abusive in practice. Malone traveled to Copper Ridge in early November, bringing with him copies of territorial records documenting the connections between current property owners and the families who had operated contract labor systems in the 1850s. What he discovered during his investigation confirmed that the Whitmore estate was just one of several properties in the region, where descendants of the original cover-up participants were maintaining labor practices that preserved the essential characteristics of the systems their ancestors had operated. The legal structures had changed, the terminology had been updated to reflect post-war sensibilities, but the fundamental relationships of control, exploitation, and violence remained intact. The Whitmore estate maintained detailed records of worker debts, payment schedules, and disciplinary actions in ledgers that were remarkably similar to the documents Harrison Blackwood had kept 40 years earlier. Workers were charged for housing, food, clothing, medical care, and tools at rates that ensured their wages would never exceed their expenses. The ledgers showed that some families had been working on the estate for over 20 years without ever achieving the financial independence that would have allowed them to leave legally. Several workers had died while still indebted, and their obligations had been transferred to their children, creating a system of inherited bondage that functioned exactly like the contract labor arrangements supposedly abolished after the war. The disciplinary records revealed that the Whitmore estate used confinement, physical punishment, and branding to maintain control over workers who challenged their conditions or attempted to leave without authorization. The branding wasn't done openly, as it had been in Harrison Blackwood's era, but rather was disguised as accidents occurring during routine ranch operations. Workers who were deemed problematic would be assigned to cattle branding duties and would suffer burns that estate managers claimed resulted from carelessness, but which consistently appeared in patterns suggesting deliberate application. The brands served the same function they had in the 1850s, marking workers as estate property and making it difficult for them to find employment elsewhere, because the scars identified them as having violated their obligations to previous employers. Peppers. Sheriff Malone's investigation of the Whitmore estate expanded to include other properties in the region, revealing a network of ranches operated by families with direct connections to the cover-up of the Blackwood execution. The estates communicated with each other about worker movements, shared information about individuals considered troublesome or likely to encourage resistance, and coordinated their labor practices to maintain consistent standards that prevented workers from improving their conditions by threatening to seek employment elsewhere. The coordination suggested that property owners understood they were operating a system that required collective maintenance to remain effective. Financial records obtained through court orders showed that several estates were generating substantial profits through their exploitative labor practices, paying workers minimal wages while charging them inflated prices for necessities and pocketing the difference. The profit margins were comparable to what contract labor operations had achieved in the 1850s, demonstrating that the economic incentives for maintaining exploitative systems remained strong, despite legal and social changes that supposedly guaranteed worker rights and freedoms. The estates were also avoiding taxes by classifying significant portions of worker compensation as company store credits rather than wages, reducing their reported payrolls while maintaining tight control over employee finances. The investigation revealed that local law enforcement in the Copper Ridge area had been compromised by the same patterns of influence and corruption that had enabled the cover-up of the Blackwood execution. The regional sheriff, a man named Daniel Porter, had financial relationships with several estate owners, including receiving gifts, loans, and business opportunities that created conflicts of interest, preventing him from effectively investigating worker complaints. Porter's department had a pattern of dismissing allegations of abuse as internal estate matters beyond law enforcement jurisdiction, refusing to investigate suspicious deaths or injuries, and occasionally assisting estate owners in capturing workers who had fled without authorization. When Malone attempted to coordinate with Porter's office on investigating conditions at the Whitmore estate, he encountered resistance that included refusals to provide backup for interviews, warnings that pursuing the investigation would damage relationships with important community members, and thinly veiled suggestions that continuing his inquiries might result in professional consequences or personal risks. The obstruction made clear that the protective networks surrounding exploitative labor practices extended throughout the region's institutions, involving not just property owners but also law enforcement officials, local judges, and business leaders, who benefited economically or politically from maintaining the existing systems. The most disturbing discovery from Malone's investigation of current conditions was evidence that the estates were using some of the same techniques for controlling information and eliminating threats that territorial authorities had employed during the 1850s. Workers who became too vocal about their treatment or who tried to organize collective action were systematically isolated, reassigned to remote locations where they would have minimal contact with other employees, or in some cases simply disappeared under circumstances that estate managers claimed involved voluntary departures or tragic accidents. The disappearances followed patterns similar to what had happened to workers after the Blackwood execution, suggesting that the elimination of problematic individuals remained an accepted practice among property owners, who considered it a necessary tool for maintaining control. Hannah Clark's teaching position became precarious once her involvement with Sheriff Malone's investigation became known to estate owners who dominated Copper Ridge's economy and politics. She received warnings from the school board that her continued employment depended on focusing on education rather than involving herself in labor disputes that weren't appropriate concerns for school teachers. Parents who worked on the estates were instructed to keep their children away from Clark, resulting in declining enrollment that threatened the school's viability. Local merchants refused to serve her, and the boarding house where she rented a room informed her that she would need to find alternative accommodations because her presence was creating problems with other tenants. The pressure on Clark was designed to force her to either leave Copper Ridge or stop cooperating with Malone's investigation, demonstrating that the systems protecting exploitative labor practices included mechanisms for punishing anyone who threatened to expose them. But Clark refused to be intimidated, continuing to document conditions she observed and providing testimony that would prove crucial in building legal cases against estate owners who had assumed they were immune to accountability because of their wealth, political connections, and control over local institutions. Sheriff Malone's investigation also uncovered evidence that some workers had been attempting to organize resistance using methods similar to those Josiah Freeman had taught in the 1850s. Secret meetings were being held in remote locations where workers from different estates could share information about conditions, discuss strategies for improving their situations, and coordinate actions that might pressure employers to modify their practices. The meetings were carefully concealed from estate managers and occurred infrequently enough to avoid detection, but informants embedded within worker communities reported the activities to property owners who responded with increased surveillance and preemptive actions against suspected organizers. The parallels between current resistance efforts and the organizational work that had preceded the Blackwood execution were striking, and suggested that knowledge of historical worker resistance had been preserved and transmitted across generations despite authorities' efforts to erase it from collective memory. Workers in 1891 were employing tactics that Freeman had pioneered, using coded language to communicate, creating distributed leadership structures that made them less vulnerable to decapitation strategies, and building networks of mutual support that provided resources and protection for individuals targeted by employers or law enforcement. One particularly significant discovery was a handwritten manual that had been circulating among workers, containing practical advice about organizing collective action, negotiating with employers, and protecting themselves from retaliation. The manual's language and concepts bore remarkable similarities to ideas that territorial authorities had attributed to Freeman in their 1850s surveillance reports, suggesting that his teachings had survived in oral traditions or written documents that had been secretly copied and shared across 4 decades. The manual's existence demonstrated that the resistance movement Freeman had inspired hadn't been successfully suppressed but rather had gone underground, adapting to changing conditions while preserving core principles about the rights of workers to organize and challenge exploitative systems. Sheriff Malone realized that his investigation had evolved from examining a historical crime into documenting an ongoing system of exploitation that connected directly to the patterns established in the 1850s. The families who had covered up the Blackwood execution hadn't done so to hide a single incident of vigilante justice. They had been protecting an entire economic system built on worker exploitation, a system they intended to preserve indefinitely by adapting its methods to changing legal and social conditions. The cover-up had succeeded in preventing the Blackwood execution from inspiring immediate widespread resistance, but it hadn't fundamentally changed the conditions that made such resistance necessary and inevitable. The challenge Malone faced was whether the legal and political systems of 1891 Colorado would support meaningful action against exploitative labor practices, or whether the same patterns of institutional complicity that had enabled the cover-up of the Blackwood execution would prevent accountability for property owners who had inherited their ancestors' wealth along with their methods of generating it through systematic human exploitation. The question wasn't just about historical justice for events that had occurred 40 years earlier, but about whether current generations would have the courage to confront ongoing crimes that were deeply embedded in the region's economic structures and protected by networks of influence extending throughout government, law enforcement, and business institutions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.